Welcome to Newsclick. To pay tribute to her contributions to the discourse on women's rights in India, today we are at the Center for Women's Development Studies to talk about that remarkable woman of the Indian women's movement who passed away in the early hours of May 30 this year, Vina Mazumdar. She was 86 years old and was among the pioneers in the field of development studies and a voice for gender equality. It is to talk about this rolling stone of the Indian women's movement that we have with us today Dr. Indu Agnihotri, Director and Professor at the CWDS. Welcome to the show, Dr. Indu. Dr. Indu, Vina Mazumdar was the founding director of Center for Women's Development Studies. Why did she want to set up such a center, and how far has the CWDS fulfilled that role?
Well, as far as the setting of the center goes, let's look at it in terms of the background of the committee that Vina Mazumdar had been part of, which was the Committee on the Status of Women in India in the early 70s. The report, which is titled Towards Equality, was submitted at the end of 1974. And from 1975 onwards, when it was printed and published, various people outside the committee were in fact reading the report and finding enough evidence in that to raise questions about the status of women in India 25 years after independence. I think this was something that Vina Di, as we all called her, and many of her colleagues in the committee these questions were running in their minds as well, because these were some of the most well-educated women that independent India had produced. They had had a fairly privileged background in terms of the opportunities and exposure they had had for education, etc. But when they went out as part of this committee, they traveled all across India, and I think, as Vinadi and her friends in this committee would always talk about it for many, many years later after that, the fact was that they were totally shocked at what they saw. The kind of poverty they saw, the kind of inequality, the kind of discrimination against women, and a total denial of opportunities to women. And I think what they felt that they had to do then was that they had to come out of their own comfort zone, in a sense, where they were at the universities or the institutions that they had always been a part of, and they felt that they had to take this forward in very many different ways. One of the ways was that as part of the committee itself, they had been in touch with some of the women leaders in India. They had interviewed these people. They had commissioned studies on women in the economy, women in terms of legal rights, on political representation, political participation, education. So these were many of the fields that opened up in the course of the findings and the work of the committee. And I think after the committee's report was presented, since as you would know, this was a report put together in time for the Mexico conference, the first World UN Conference on Women in 1975. In fact, in Mexico also, it turned out to be one of the most well-researched, well-documented reports at the international level. It created quite a stir in the Mexico conference. And coming back from that conference, what everyone felt who had been associated with that committee, they felt that they had to take that agenda forward in different ways. The first step that Vina Mazumdar took was that she joined the Indian Council for Social Science Research, that is the ICSSR, which also set up the first women's studies unit in India, and which commissioned research around with a focus on women, on gender exclusion, gender inequalities, etc. Subsequent to that, and you would be aware that the 1970s was a decade where in fact development studies was very much the on the rise in terms of all abroad, all international fora. You will find Sussex has the Institute of Development Studies. So development studies was a new opening up field which took off from economics primarily at one level, but also combined it with interdisciplinary perspectives to critique development policies and with a view to actually addressing social trends, inequalities on the ground. And I think it was as part of that process that they took it forward further to then set up the first center, which was an independent center under the ICSSR, supported by ICSSR and others, with a focus on research on women. And the objective was to take forward both research with a focus on women, which was sadly lacking in the 1970s. So you could have all the social science disciplines, for instance, conducting research and teaching with no specific mention of women. Many of us found, for instance, I come from the discipline of history, that we could actually study history in a so-called sort of gender-neutral way. So I think there was a very clear agenda that policies, programs, government, state level, state orientation had to be engaged with, interrogated and addressed, as well as take it forward in terms of research, and which then emerged as women's studies as an interdisciplinary perspective. And she also helped set up the Indian Association for Women's Studies in 1981-82, which has also emerged as a full-fledged professional body subsequently.
Dr. Indu, as we know, Vina Mazumdar was an activist as well as an educationist. How significant do you think her dual role as an activist and as an academic was to her contribution to the women's movement?
Vina Di had been associated with the Kothari Commission when she was at the UGC. And I think there was one thing which very clear in her mind, that education was one of the means and instruments to advance the cause of equality, and not just gender equality. She believed in equality in social terms, in political terms, in economic terms, and for her that remained a concern throughout. Even as late as 1986, for instance, she was part of the drafting of the national educational policy, which took its title from something that she wrote, which is Education for Equality. That remained an agenda, but advancing education amongst women was a key concern as part of that, and advancing education where it was to open up new fields, new opportunities, and not just with a stereotypical notion of what should be the special kind of education that women should receive. You know, this has been a debate in the system within the context of education, because there is an understanding that people have that women should be specially prepared for their future roles, which would be like mothers or whatever. And I think that was one thing that Vina Di very clearly disagreed with. She felt that you had to break out of those stereotypes, and education had to prepare women for all kinds of roles. So they should not be put in any kind of a box. They should not be sort of subject to prejudices and discriminations from their inception. So schooling, school education, higher education were meant to open up more avenues and open up minds of young people. That was very clear in her agenda. As far as the movement is concerned, I think her relationship to the movement was at several levels. She was, I don't think she was a part of any other organization in terms of a women's organization except CWDS, which she founded, but she used the institutional base of the CWDS and its rich resources in terms of the library that was being built up, the kind of research that was generated, the kind of data that could be garnered, which was an exercise she had already done as part of preparation of the report towards equality. And she felt that this had to be fed in to bring in more critical perspectives within the movement, to sort of strengthen the interventions of the women's movement. And therefore she was open to aligning herself with women's organizations which existed at that time. Some of them were new. She played a key role in putting together a platform of national women's organizations, which she sometimes and actually often referred to as Seven Sisters. But this was an organization comprising of the All India Women's Conference, which was one of the oldest organizations in India, the National Federation of Indian Women, the YWCA, the Mahila Dakshata Samiti at that time, the All India Democratic Women's Association, CWDS itself, and the Joint Women's Program. So this network of national women's organizations, I think, played a key role, and in that Vina Mazumdar and under her leadership the Center for Women's Development Studies played a key role in making one point, I think, which is central, that there was a need to engage with state policy. This need was determined and driven by the impact of these policies on the ground and on the everyday lives of ordinary women. So they were very much at the center of the policy. It was not individual rights, it was not a particular class, but the mass of women, the peasant women, tribal women, women living on the margins, women living in poverty and in socially, economically deprived segments of society. And I think the 70s saw a network, including of development studies, women associated with development studies, and using those perspectives to engage with official policies both at the international UN level as well as within their own countries.
Dr. Indu, among her many contributions that you just discussed, what do you feel is her one most significant contribution to the women's movement?
I don't know if I can say that there is one single contribution, because I think she was an institution builder. She believed in inculcating critical thought amongst, she believed also in encouraging young scholars, young minds. She always found time to sit down and discuss with people, young students who she met at conferences. She would sit up late in the night discussing with younger people. Very few people who saw her only in the later years know that since 1980-81, she had started a whole process of what we call action research, which was very dear to her heart, and she was very passionately involved with programs for collective mobilization and organization of peasant women and tribal women, and CWDS is still running those programs in 3 districts. She was able to convey a sense of and the need for critical thought and develop that spirit amongst women who had historically and socially been denied opportunities to develop those skills. And she saw that as a challenge, she took it on, and she sustained that challenge for a long time. I mean, she could have comfortably continued to be a social scientist, serving on committees as and when the government called upon her. But I think she took that as a calling, particularly from what she saw in the course of her travel during the preparation of the committee, report of the Committee on the Status of Women in India. So I would say that she was a very, very multifaceted personality. To capture her contribution in any one way, maybe to see it in a limited sense. If you saw what she contributed as pressure in terms of government policies, new thinking, new initiatives. For instance, it was in the course of the 1980 dialogue on the 6th plan that this idea of allocating 40% resources to women and to women's development and targeting them at women was floated. And somewhere that still continues to hover, and this whole thing of 1/3 critical mass, 1/3 in terms of reservation, which was an issue she had raised in towards equality. She and Lotika Sarkar had dissented from the other members, feeling that more concrete and specific efforts needed to be made to draw women into the political process if India was to develop as a stable and vibrant democracy. As I said, she was a student of politics and history, and she understood the social dynamics and the processes very well. And she sought to put her energy in taking a process of democratic engagement with policy planning and social change on the ground, melding all these together.
So speaking of reservations, those were the major reasons behind her position on women's reservation for women.
Yeah. She didn't believe in tokenism of any kind. She didn't. She felt women had to be there in their own right as citizens. But that special efforts had to be made because there were long histories of discrimination, long histories of cultural discrimination, as well as political, caste-based or class-based inequalities. As a social scientist, she had a more holistic perspective. She looked at it from all possible aspects, and she felt that critical interventions were needed, and she would not shy away from that. She wouldn't shy away from differing from a government position if she felt that that was not going to take this process forward.
Being part of the women's movement, what did feminism mean to her, especially in the Indian context?
I think her position on feminism was slightly different from many others. She hardly ever used to use the word feminist to either describe herself or her activity or her work. She stood for interventions on behalf of women, and women as being part of society. So she would not want to see women as a separate category from other aspects of social development.
One final question, Dr. Indu. What kind of impact or influence did Vina Di have on you?
I don't know if I can answer that. I met her in 1978 when I was still a young student, when efforts were on to bring out a magazine which all of you may have heard of called Manushi, of which she was the first publisher, and we had an editorial collective, and I was a part of the editorial collective. And since then, looking back on my life, I can't think of not knowing, having known Vina Di, not just in terms of my relationship with her in terms of interaction, but in terms of, I think, a sharing of ideas, a sharing of concerns. And for me, it was a very long process in my different capacities as a student, as a teacher of history in Delhi University, as an activist, and then subsequently as a colleague in CWDS. But I think what brought us together was really the common concerns, and also I think we shared our grounding in history and concerns about the future of democracy and social change in India, and I think that's what kept us together.
Thank you for talking to us, Dr. Indu.
Thank you. Thank you very much.